Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're getting into a really critical time just after World War II, looking at Eastern Europe and, well, how things started getting frosty between the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
Yet that early Cold War tension kicking off. We've got some history textbook excerpts to help us unpack it.
Exactly. And our mission here is to really understand those clashing perspectives, the motivations behind the big moves, and answer some of the specific questions you've brought to us about this period.
Okay, let's start with how Stalin and Truman saw Eastern Europe. Because they saw it very differently, didn't they?
Oh, completely. From the American side, Truman's side, the Soviet actions looked like they were just trampling over self-determination. Our sources say the West was alarmed by Stalin's takeover.
Right. They saw it as the Soviets forcing their system onto these countries, creating this sphere of influence.
Yeah, imposing it. But Stalin, from his perspective, you have to remember the context, the massive losses Russia suffered in the war.
Absolutely. Security was likely paramount. The sources mentioned the Soviets expected friendly governments. For them, it was probably about creating a necessary buffer zone.
A security belt, maybe? Source 18 implies they were actively working to make sure governments were pro-Soviet, seeing it as vital for their own safety and regional power.
And that fundamental difference really flared up over Greece, didn't it?
It did. Greece was in chaos after the war, a civil war, basically, between the monarchists, who the British initially backed, and communist rebels.
And this made the West extremely nervous. Why Greece specifically?
Well, the fear was if Greece fell to communism, it could start a chain reaction, a domino effect across Europe.
Especially as Britain admitted they couldn't afford to keep supporting the monarchists anymore. Source 17 points out Greece and also Czechoslovakia were seen as vulnerable, and what happened there would heavily influence U.S. policy.
Which leads us right to the Truman Doctrine. What was that, essentially?
The Truman Doctrine was basically a new U.S. policy commitment. It stated the U.S. would provide aid money, military support to any country fighting against communist pressure or takeover.
So Greece was the trigger.
It was the immediate catalyst, yeah. It marked a big shift. The U.S. actively stepping in to contain communism, not just watch it.
We also need to remember the backdrop to all this, the state of Europe itself. It was shattered, right?
Early. The sources mention the physical poverty of Europe and Asia. We're talking destroyed cities, economies in ruins, massive social disruption, just widespread hardship.
And that kind of devastation makes societies vulnerable, doesn't it?
Definitely. People are desperate, looking for answers, maybe more open to extreme ideas or outside influence promising stability. It creates instability.
Okay, so in walks George Marshall with his plan. What was his thinking? What was the solution he saw?
Marshall believed that economic recovery was the absolute key. Fix the economies, create stability, and you reduce the appeal of communism.
Makes sense. Prevent desperation from breeding extremism.
Exactly. Source 20 says Marshall Aid was about tackling the distress and deprivation, but also, crucially, about creating new markets for American goods.
So Marshall Aid was this huge package of U.S. economic help for European rebuilding. But then came Czechoslovakia in 1948. Why did that event cause such specific alarm in the U.S.?
Because Czechoslovakia wasn't like some of the other Eastern European states. It had a real democratic history before the war.
Right.
So when the communists took over there quite forcefully, it wasn't just seen as expanding the Soviet buffer zone. It looked like actively dismantling a democracy.
It confirmed the worst fears about Soviet intentions, maybe, that they wouldn't stop at Eastern Europe.
Precisely. It really solidified Western anxieties about Soviet expansionism.
Which brings us back to Marshall Aid and the question of American self-interest. It sounds like it wasn't just about helping Europe out of the goodness of their hearts.
Well, yes and no. Source 20 does mention it was seen as a very generous act.
Yeah.
And I think there was genuine humanitarian concern. But there were clear strategic and economic benefits for the U.S. too. Economically, a rebuilt, prosperous Europe meant customers for American products. That's explicitly stated creating markets. You see hints in cartoon source 21 as well.
Okay, so economic self-interest was definitely part of the calculation. What about the political angle?
Politically, it was about containment. Strengthening Western European economies made them less susceptible to communist ideology and influence. It bolstered nations aligned with the U.S.
Like pulling them further into the Western orbit. Cartoon Source 22 sort of depicts it that way, like a lifeline.
Exactly. And Source 20 connects it to avoiding another global economic slump like the 1930s, which Americans feared could fuel extremism and instability, including communism. So it was intertwined.
So wrapping this up, we've got these starkly different ways Stalin and Truman saw Eastern Europe unfolding. We have the flashpoint in Greece leading to the Truman Doctrine. Then there's the sheer post-war devastation, which Marshall Aid aimed to fix.
Right, with that mix of genuine aid and, let's be honest, American self-interest, both economic and political.
Yep.
And finally, the shock of Czechoslovakia solidifying Western fears.
It paints a picture of rapidly escalating mistrust.
It really does. Which leads us to the final thought for you, the listener. Looking at these different perspectives, the security fears, the economic needs, the ideological clash, how inevitable was this slide into a deeper Cold War right then? Could things, realistically, have gone another way? Something to think about.